Thank you, Madam Acting Speaker. Madam Acting Speaker, I must say that in discussing the Identification Legislation Amendment Bill 2011 around my electorate, I received a great deal of advice. There was some wide consultation. And in my opening remarks, Madam Speaker, if I can just thank members of the various ethnic communities in my electorate, as well as my predecessor, Mr Wayne Merton, and members of the New South Wales Police, past and present, who I discussed this legislation with in preparation for both this debate and the eventual passing of this legislation. We must identify from the outset, Madam Acting Speaker, that this bill has nothing to do with race, religion or creed. This legislation is simply a reflection of our modern society. It is quite ironic, if not disappointing, that it had to be brought up in a fashion of debate which we're seeing accusations of racism and the like from various extreme elements in the community. There is nothing racist about this legislation. There is nothing untoward about this legislation. This legislation isn't suggesting to anybody that their religion or their culture is any better or any worse than the other cultures and nationalities that are represented in modern Australian society. Madam Acting Deputy Speaker, this legislation simply grants the New South Wales Police the powers to identify a person by removing their face covering. That removal will occur because individuals need to be identified. We live in a community which, unfortunately, we see acts of crime, acts of terrorism, acts of irregular acts which can be easily covered over simply because we fail to identify individuals. We have a growth in identification theft in modern Australian society. We have a growth in simple retail theft. We have a growth in bank robberies. We have a growth in robberies in many retail outlets. And this legislation, in my view, will assist the police and other law enforcement authorities in identifying the culprits. Madam Acting Speaker, it's my belief that this amendment will enhance the ability of New South Wales Police to execute their duty to enforce the laws of the state of New South Wales. I don't think that you will find a policeman in New South Wales that actually is happy to have this authority. Madam Acting Speaker, despite what you'll hear from various extreme elements in the community, nobody wants to deny somebody their cultural identity. Nobody wants to force somebody to do anything that they don't want to do. This legislation is simply giving law enforcement officers, people that have been sworn defenders of our legislation, to quite rightly identify anybody that has been at risk of anybody that might have be the culprit of a crime. This amendment is not about affecting any of those particular groups within our community. And we must say at this side of the House that we've noted this amendment applies equally to all coverings. As was mentioned by a previous speaker, we're not out there simply getting one gender. We're not out there simply getting one nationality. We're not out there simply trying to get at one group that might be in the community that has a certain practice. Everybody will be required to remove their identification, remove any coverings over their face for the purposes of identifying an individual. Whether it be a female wearing a burqa or a courier wearing a helmet, everybody will need to comply with the same legislation. And this legislation is important because it will reinforce the Australian respect for the rule of law. We've got a great Australian tradition which certainly embraces the need for a fair go, for people to be honest, for people to understand that the law is there to protect us, not to punish us. This amendment will be about providing an effective maintenance of these laws, and it will protect and benefit our community. Madam Acting Deputy Speaker, it's noticed that this isn't an excessive expansion of police powers. In fact, if you look at the tolerance that is displayed by New South Wales Police and other law enforcement agencies in Australia, we've actually got a very moderate approach to the powers of arrest. We've actually got a very moderate approach to powers of the powers that the police might need to use in identifying culprits. When you're looking at some of the countries of Western Europe, and certainly in the Middle East, the powers that are entrusted on the police are quite horrific from an Australian point of view. This legislation is actually reasonably moderate because it is providing a rule of law that will certainly be implemented and affect every person that might see for one reason or another, to have their face covered. It's been mentioned in the legislation, of course, that these expectations that we have in our community about face covering will have adequate safeguards, and that's an important message for us to get out. Under common law, people always will have the right to appeal a decision from prosecution or enforcement, and this legislation will continue the safeguard mechanism that is so vital in Western democracies. As mentioned before, also, Madam Acting Speaker, police must seek cooperation first. This isn't certainly legislation that will allow a policeman on the beat to simply march up and demand somebody to remove or force them to remove their coverings. The police, with these safeguards, will be required to seek the assistance of anybody who may have their face covered at an inappropriate time, and they'll be certainly invited and asked to provide some sort of support and assistance with the police trying to go about the course of their duties. The amendment allows for mandatory facial identifications in circumstances where identification is already required. So again, there is not terribly much new in that. Madam Acting Speaker, as the Attorney-General has already stated, this new mechanism will be subject to review from the Ombudsman for the next 12 months. So again, this goes one step beyond normal legislation, which is not only providing safeguards, but we're also suggesting to the community that we're going to be open for any amendments within 12 months, and we've given the independence of the Ombudsman the authority to conduct that review. Madam Acting Speaker, as I've already said, this bill is not about any particular group in the community, but it's about protecting our laws and our way of life. And I think for that reason, the community accepts that this legislation is an unfortunate reality. It's important to note that all community groups that may be affected by this legislation have been consulted, and that includes, Madam Speaker, the very diverse Muslim community in Sydney. Some Muslims, as you're well aware, Madam Acting Deputy Speaker, choose to wear the burqas, others do not. And so that's why you'll probably find there have been a variety of views expressed by the Islamic community in Sydney, and they have certainly been consulted both by the Attorney-General and by the Minister for Multiculturalism, and I'm sure, Madam Speaker, like me, many other members of this House. This amendment has been brought about with the cooperation of that community, and I'd certainly like to acknowledge the very responsible manner in which the ministers responsible have engaged with the community to ensure that everybody is satisfied with the outcome of this particular bill. Madam Acting Speaker, I'd like to point out that several Muslim community groups have indicated their support of this legislation. And as I mentioned, Madam Acting Speaker, in my opening remarks, the diverse ethnic community in my own electorate and the community of the Hills have provided some of their advice and the courtesy of their engagement in the preparation for this legislation into the Legislative Assembly, Madam Acting Speaker, and all of them have acknowledged that this is an unfortunate reality of modern society. Madam Acting Speaker, this bill places security and law enforcement with the protection for the individual at the heart of public administration in New South Wales, and I commend it to the House.